Hi folks, in this video I'm going to be covering how I painted this Hormigaunt Tyranid figure in the Hive Fleet Behemoth scheme. It's a really nice, bold and vibrant scheme with lots of interesting colours and techniques that you can use quite quickly to paint up a Tyranid army that looks striking on the table. So without any further ado, let's cue the music. To start out with, I'm going to be painting a base coat of Mephiston Red from Games Workshop all over the skin areas of this Tyranid. I've thinned this down with a little bit of water as I'm looking to get coverage in about 2 to 3 thin coats. The Tyranids model, this one's on the older side. We know that there are now new sculpts for the Hormigaunts, but due to the nature of the closeness of the detail on all those ribbing ventilation style markers on the nids, we do want to make sure that we're doing this in thin coats as to make sure that none of the detail is clogged up. And it's just a matter of going around and making sure that all the primer is covered with this red paint. You can prime whatever colour you like. If you use a grey or white primer, this red is going to come out more vibrant, but I like to use a black primer for Hive Fleet Behemoth because of all the black carapace and the black claws that we're going to be doing, and red is a colour that covers nicely over a black primer. So don't stress about being neat about this. We're going to come in with other colours and neaten this up later, so just make sure you get nice, smooth, thin coats until you get a nice solid coverage over the model. Here we have the Tyranid Hormigaunt after 3 thin coats of the red have been applied. For the next step, I'm going to be adding some shadows and definition to all the recesses on this model. And to do this, I'm coming in with some ahkelian green contrast paint that I've thinned down with some contrast medium and a little bit of water to ensure that it flows nicely into the recesses. And although this looks like it's going on quite turquoise, this will darken down quite a lot and give a nice blue definition into the shadows. The reason that I'm going for a blue shade onto this model is that Hive Fleet Behemoth has that blue-black carapace, and this sort of turquoisey blue really allows that to tie into that colour scheme, so everything looks a lot more uniform. If you don't have the contrast paint, don't worry, you could just use a blue wash or thin down some blue paint. But I do like the contrast paints for doing this sort of technique. I think it actually works better than their traditional method, as this is acting more like a filter onto the red, rather than I'm going to make everything dark and dim everything down as well as putting some paint into the shadows. And as you can see, I'm being quite messy with this. Just try to make sure that you don't get too much surface pooling due to the nature of the contrast paints, but if you're careful and make sure that it doesn't pool too much and doesn't drip too much, then you should be okay. And if you really don't like it, don't worry, you can always just paint back over with the red and do a more traditional pin layering wash with a dark blue paint. And once the contrast paint has dried, you can see that using that blue colour really does make a nice deep burgundy red colour, which is a lot more interesting, I think, than the standard black wash you might see. To start our first highlight on the model, I'm going to be coming in with a dry brush of Mephiston Red, and I'm going to be using this dry brush in a zenithal motion, and so I'm going to be hitting the tops of the limbs where the light's going to be the strongest, hitting this Tyranid, focusing on the tops of the joints, the upper arms, the wrists, the elbows, and leaving the contrast paint as a nice fade into shadow. And you can do as much as little as you want on this. When it comes to dry brushing, I always do recommend starting with a little and working your way up to a nice solid finish, as it's very easy to add more and it's very difficult to take this effect away. And if you want, you could layer this up, but these Tyranid gaunts will take you an absolute ice age if you want to layer and glaze everything, and the dry brush does pick out the detail quite nicely, and these organic shapes really do lend to dry brushing. So it's just a matter of picking out those raised areas in a top-down motion with the Mephiston Red, our base colour, in a dry brush. Once we are happy with our layering up dry brush of Mephiston red, I'm then coming in with a second pass, this time with Evil Sunz Scarlet from Games Workshop. And just like the previous step, I'm focused on areas that are going to be hit by the light. So you can see here, there's the shoulders, the hips, the back of the knees, on the some of these weird wristy things that he's got going into the claws. And I'm going to be covering probably about 50% of the area we covered with the Mephiston red. And when it comes to the tail, I'm going to be dry brushing that bottom third. And this is going to give us a nice quick transition that when you look at it from the tabletop at about 3 feet away, it's going to look really nice and smooth, and it's really going to help pop from that bluey red shadow all the way up to these brighter red tones that we're doing on the skin. As an optional final stage on the red highlight, I'm coming in with some Wild Rider red and just picking out the very tops of the raised areas on this Tyranid model. You may want to leave this for any larger or character models that you have, but I'm showing you on this Hormigaunt so you get a complete idea of what this blue contrast over Mephiston all the way up to Wild Rider red looks like, and it really gives this a nice variation in red tones, going from a dark burgundy to an almost orangey vibe on the model. With the red areas on this model now complete, we can now focus on putting down a black base coat on all of the areas that we want to have this blue-black finish on the Tyranid. And I'm coming in here with some Vallejo model colour black, but you can use whatever black you want. It doesn't really matter, it's just a matter of using your favourite. And with this, I've thinned it down with a little bit of water, and I'm just looking to get a nice smooth coverage over all the areas that we're going to be painting in this iridescent blue-black finish. So this is things like the hooves, the claws, the big spiky things out the front, these things that the Hormigaunt's going to rip you to pieces with, and all of the chitin and carapace on the miniature. And it's just a matter of taking your time and trying to be neat. And don't worry if you overspill. Wait for it to dry and then go back in with your base colour of Mephiston red to neaten up any mistakes that you might make. But I'd recommend switching to a smaller brush just to give yourself that little bit of control. For the first highlight on the black carapace and chitin, I'm coming in with some Kantor blue from Games Workshop, and I've thinned this down a little bit more than normal, so it's not quite as thin as you would a wash, but it's certainly thinner than a layer consistency. And with this, I'm applying some onto the carapace, and I'm pulling it in directional strokes to where I want the concentration of the blue pigment to be highest. When you paint a model, the pigment is left behind in the strongest concentration when you pick the brush up from the model. And so with this thin paint in these directional strokes, we are causing a transition of paint from the black to the dark blue. And as you can see, I'm keeping it very thin, so I'm probably going to do this in a couple of passes. And we're not too worried about having a neat edge or a soft transition with this. What we are looking for is just that transition of colour at this point. We are going to be coming in with some brighter blues, and so it will soften out this initial transitional fade. But it's just a matter of where you want the bit of chitin to be lightest, being hit by the light and showing that iridescent blue-black. I'm going to be doing this. Generally, the community tends to do these towards the back of these chitin plates on the top of the model, and then we do the same on the head, and then we would pull towards tips of claws and tips of horns. When it comes to painting these claws or talons on Hive Behemoth, I'm starting out with an edge highlight on the upper surface and the upper edges of these talons, and then I'm painting about 50% of the talon in this Kantor blue. As you can see, it's going on pretty thin, and once I've applied it on this about 50% area, making sure to pull towards the tip of the claw, I am taking a wet brush and softening out that transition by moving the brush backwards and forwards in a feathering motion. What this is doing is preventing a sharp line between the Kantor blue and the black that we have done in our previous step, especially as I have used Vallejo model color black, which has a very slightly different finish. It's a little bit more matte, so that feathering out of that dark blue is a little bit more important if the black you're using is a more matte finish. You will find that feathering is less of an issue if you're using game color black or using abandoned black from Games Workshop. But the trick here with this is to do those directional strokes, pulling that pigment towards the tip of the claws and using a wet brush to soften it out, and then you'll find yourself getting a really nice finish with this blue-black carapace. For the first highlight of the blue, I'm coming in with Teclis Blue from Games Workshop. And what I'm doing with this is a zenithal edge highlight, so I'm only highlighting the upper edges and the edges that are going to catch light, and then I'm going to paint probably about the bottom third of this talon. And I'm pulling the pigment towards the tip of the talon and using a wet brush to soften out and feather that transition between the Teclis Blue and the Kantor Blue. And there's no real exact technique on how you're going to feather out that soft transition. The real trick is to keep your paint thinner than a layer consistency, but slightly thicker than a glaze. If you were to do this with a glaze consistency, you'd be here all evening, and when it comes to gaunts, we don't have time for that. So keep it at a thin consistency, but not too thin, and then just focus on painting that bottom third towards the tip of the talon. When it comes to highlighting the carapace on this Tyranid gaunt, I'm taking the Teclis Blue and I'm painting along this raised ridge along the spine. And then I'm starting to do some thin directional lines with this thin paint towards the direction of where the blue is the highest concentration. And this is a very common traditional thing to do with Tyranids, to have these thin lines going backwards to take that colour transition. But there's no real secret to this. Keep your paint nice and thin and then do these directional short jabbing lines. I'd recommend switching to a brush with a really nice point. You'll probably find that unless you're using something really fancy, that a size 1 or a size 0 is probably your best bet for this, or a small layer brush from Games Workshop. And just finding that strongest point of where the light's going to hit and start working towards it in these jagged lines. And on that shoulder blade there, I've thinned it down and I'm putting a reflex highlight in with it. Remember, there's no right amount. If you want to do this as quite a stark contrast difference, you can cover most of the Kantor blue. If you want this to just look more like a shiny iridescent thing, then you can focus in smaller lines, focusing more towards the edges. But I've gone quite blue with this, as I really like the stark difference it makes against the red, and making the black feel more like a shadow rather than the majority colour on this gaunt. And here is the carapace once that Teclis Blue has been applied. As a last highlight on the blue, I'm coming in with some Temple Guard Blue from Games Workshop. And with this I've switched to a fine detailed brush, and I'm picking out a zenithal edge highlight on the very tips of the highest concentration of blue, and then doing some dots and scratches on the raised surfaces that are going to be in shadow. And I'm highlighting the underneath the tip here, and here you can see I'm using just the side of the brush to do some dots and scratches into the black, and this is going to give the impression of a shimmering colour, like this is the whole thing is iridescent, and it's just how the light is hitting, just the tips of these talons are this bright electric blue. But if it was to twist the light, then the back end would light up in this colour. So I'm focusing on this very specific edge highlight and doing dots and scratches into the areas of shadows. You don't have to do too much in the dots and scratches. It's just to cause the tips and the highest areas of detail to be picked out and really stand out and give some definition to the shapes. When it comes to the carapace, I'm doing exactly the same as what I did in the previous step, but here I'm using the very tip of the brush, and I'm really just focusing on the very edge of the ridges and on the highest point on the carapace, doing that nice little edge highlight. You might want to do a small amount of this if you want to retain that blue-black feel. For a nice easy eye on this Tyranid gaunt, take your favourite yellow and with a fine detail brush, fill in the area where there's the eyeball on the model. I'm using Averland Sunset from Games Workshop for this because I find that it covers really nicely with just a little bit of thinning, and we're only touching right onto this very small area on this gaunt. We don't need to do any layering or hiding or shadows with this. This will be enough to cause it to stand out. When it comes to painting teeth on Tyranid gaunts, I tend to go for a very simple approach. I'm applying a base coat here of tallarn sand from Games Workshop, but any dark bone or tan colour will do here. If you're doing this on a larger Tyranid model, I would personally paint the area black and then do this, leaving the black as a gum line. This is just a very quick and easy method of way of doing the teeth. Here is we're going to come in with this nice base coat and then we're going to give it a nice wash afterwards just to have that definition of the teeth on the miniature. To add some definition to the teeth on this Tyranid gaunt, I am washing over the tallarn sand with some Seraphim sepia from Games Workshop. It doesn't need a lot here, just enough to allow the teeth shapes to pop out. You can also use this sepia tone to put any definition into the vents in these meshed areas on the Tyranid arms, on the red body. You can use it to do these stretched muscles on the jawline and the divots in the side of the head, and anywhere else you want to feel like you need to regain some shadow and definition onto the model that might have been lost in other stages due to dry brushing on these, especially on the older Tyranid sculpts, where the layers are much less defined due to the age of the sculpts. And with that, this Hormigaunt miniature for Hive Fleet Behemoth is now complete. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and got some ideas on how to paint your own Tyranid miniatures. If you liked this video, why not consider subscribing? It's free of charge, it helps me out, and you get further tutorials just like this one in your YouTube feed. So, until next time folks.